Wrath of the Lich King was a great time for engineering, since a lot of new concepts and conveniences were introduced. It's hard to know where to begin with it all. I guess I'll start where engineers themselves had to begin, with the materials that went into engineering. For starters, Blizzard kept the same philosophy for gems as they had in the Burning Crusade. There were 6 colors of gems, there were meta gems, and as new content came out they added epic level gems as well, just like in the Burning Crusade. At first these were raid only, but later on, Blizzard made epic gems easier to acquire, for instance by prospecting titanium ore. Good move. Also, the system of primal elements and motes of elements made a comeback, with crystallized elements taking the place of motes and eternal elements instead of primals. It was pretty much the same as in the Burning Crusade, except devolving eternals into crystallized was easier than turning primals into motes. Blizzard made one change to the metal rules. In every expansion since the Burning Crusade, there have been pretty much 3 metals that you can mine. An early common one, which was Fel Iron in the Burning Crusade and Cobalt in Wrath, a late common one, which was Adamantite in the Burning Crusade and Serenite in Wrath, and an uncommon one that the late common mining nodes occasionally spawned as. This was Corium for the Burning Crusade and Titanium for Wrath. But in Wrath of the Lich King, Blizzard added a transmuted metal. This wasn't totally without precedent. In vanilla, there was Arcanite, which was transmuted from thorium in an arcane crystal. The transmuted metal in Wrath was Titan steel, but miners could smelt it instead of relying on an alchemist to do the transmute. This top-level transmuted metal has stayed with the game ever since. Since the transmute was on a cooldown, it meant that the materials that went into high-level gear in Wrath were in short supply, which helped to keep the price up and made them feel like they were really worth something. The system of primal nethers sort of made a comeback, but instead it was called frozen orbs. And each new tier of content had a different kind of orb. Ulduar had ruined orbs, and when those were released, frozen orbs became tradable. Then Trial of the Crusader had Crusader orbs, which didn't look like orbs to me, but then ruin orbs became tradable. And Icecrown Citadel had primal Serenite. Actually, the Burning Crusade followed this philosophy as well, with materials that drop off of bosses, but, well, a lot of players never got to see those. Generally, these higher-level orbs were used to create armor of various types. Unfortunately, engineers, since we could only craft weapons and not armor, never got a chance to use them. On that subject, I found that engineers in general make far, far fewer items than blacksmiths can, for instance. I don't want to make it sound like Wrath was a disappointment for engineers, because it was not. For one thing, engineers had something called a Zap Throttle Mode Extractor. That made engineering border on being a gathering profession instead of a crafting profession. Introduced in the Burning Crusade, this allowed us to gather motes out of clouds of gas that only we could see and interact with. It was incredibly useful in Wrath and allowed us to get elements like air and fire, which were very difficult to get otherwise. And Blizzard seems to have built a few areas like the hot springs in the Borean Tundra and all of Sholazar Basin, as if they wanted engineers to harvest a lot of eternal fire from those. And eternal fire was in high demand, so engineers could actually turn a really good profit this way. One of the things Eternal Fires were good for was crafting frost-resist gear, which was important in the first tier of content since Kel'Thuzad had a lot of frost damage and was the final boss of Noxermas. You know, in retrospect, another thing I should have mentioned in the vanilla videos. In vanilla, the question of which type of damage your spells dealt mattered. Some enemies were immune to certain types of damage, some enemies in Blackwing Lair take more damage from certain elements. But as the game progressed, Blizzard realized that the type of damage shouldn't make so much of a difference, because then it severely gimps certain classes and specs when they either specialize in a type of damage that doesn't work well, or don't even have the right types of damage to function. By the same token, in vanilla it also mattered what kind of damage enemies did too, because you needed to gear yourself to have resistance to that type of damage. For instance, if you wanted to tank Molten Core, you needed to get Dark Iron Plate on your tank. Blizzard made it a little bit easier to gear up for dungeons by ceasing to make plus resist gear roughly during Wrath of the Lich King, and they also stopped tuning bosses around the idea that resist gear was needed. This shift in philosophy where the type of damage no longer matters might be part of the reason why some of the weirder engineering gadgets from vanilla, like the Flame Deflector, never made a comeback in future expansions. Of course, I still can't complain because engineering had a lot of other fun toys and a lot of them were introduced in Wrath. For instance, Tinkers. They were new in Wrath and very convenient and very fun. Tinkers were a well-thought-out replacement for an older system of engineering craftables. Engineers in vanilla could make things like rocket boots or a parachute cloak, and when you click on either of those you get a speed boost or a slow descent. However, having these usable craftables had some drawbacks. For instance, the stats on them became quickly outclassed. The Tinker system solved this problem by allowing engineers to turn any cloak or any boots into a parachute cloak or rocket boots. After you apply your Tinker to your equipment, the equipment has the same stats as before, or better, but when you click it, you get a speed boost or a slow descent. It was much more convenient and gave us much more freedom to equip ourselves with whatever we liked. Tinkers also made up for the relative lack of trinkets that did something. Only the Gnomish lightning generator really did anything. And that's not actually a Gnomish engineering item. I'll get into the Goblin versus Gnomish engineering thing later. There were a lot of other cool and convenient toys engineers got. For instance, we could summon a mailbox wherever we wanted, and we got Jeeves. Repair bots had always been an iconic and important part of engineering. Since raids were so hard and you died a lot, you needed repairs. So having an engineer around who can summon a repair bot was a really good thing. The only problem for engineers is that you have to keep spending materials in order to keep building repair bots until Jeeves came around. Jeeves was a gizmo on a cooldown. And Jeeves could sell regents, which were very important back then, and he could even let an engineer access his bank anywhere. This was very convenient and very useful. Another amazing toy was the Mechgineer's Chopper. It was awesome because we could sell it for a profit, and I did that. It was in demand because, besides the sheer awesomeness of having a motorcycle in WoW, it could take a passenger, and it was one of the few player-controllable vehicles that could be summoned as a mount. Blizzard also kept the engineering goggles around. However, in the Burning Crusade you could upgrade your goggles, but in Wrath of the Lich King and every expansion since, they really haven't given engineers that option, sad to say. Another great thing about engineering, there was not one, but two epic level guns at the end of Wrath's engineering progression. One was the armor-plated combat shotgun, which had strength and was meant for tanks. Keep in mind, ranged weapons had their own slot back then. And the other was the Nezingwary 4000, and it had agility and was meant for hunters and rogues. They looked different from each other and cool, and they were in high demand. Plus, the sheer fact that we had more than one thing to craft at the end of our progression felt awesome too. Because engineering had all of this going for it, it did not yet sting that there was almost no difference between Goblin and Gnomish engineering. It was a little bit in favor of Goblins at this point because Goblins got to make two bombs that Gnomes couldn't make, and Gnomes got X-ray glasses that made other characters look naked. This was hilarious, but it doesn't really help you in combat, but really, Gnomish and Goblin engineering were hardly different. Blizzard made an attempt at making them different in the endgame. There were bullets that only Goblin engineers could make, and arrows that only Gnomes could make. And yes, hunters did need to get ammo for their guns and bows back in those days. That went away in Cataclysm, so you can see how long these ammo recipes lasted. I never got to try them out because it took Honored Reputation with the Ashen Verdict and some Primal Serenite, and I wasn't raiding at the time, and you had to raid in order to get that reputation. Wait a minute. I just said the word reputation, didn't I? It's hard to believe that I haven't mentioned reputation in this series at all. Oh well, better late than never. Reputations have been in World of Warcraft since vanilla, and there have been a lot of ways to boost your reputation with a given faction over the years. There's turning in items that drop off of enemies, just plain killing a lot of enemies. Daily quests and dungeons can help boost rep too. And there are rewards for getting to different statuses in your reputation. For instance, Honored Reputation often gets you maximum level non-heroic gear. Revered often got you gear that was on par with the stuff that dropped out of Heroics, and sometimes when you hit Exalted you can even get stuff that was on par with what dropped in Raids. It varies from expansion to expansion, but in general, the better your reputation, the better the gear you can get. In the Burning Crusade, if you wanted to run a dungeon in order to boost your reputation, you had to choose a particular dungeon if you wanted to boost a particular reputation. Wrath of the Lich King changed that with the tabard system. When you wear a particular tabard to represent a particular faction, then it doesn't matter which dungeon you run, you will boost your reputation with that faction by running that dungeon. And because heroics were so accessible, it was easy to build reputation with the launch factions that had tabards. It's worth adding, since raid gear is often at the end of the reputation progression, the overall progression of your character, and the overall progression of your guild if you're a raiding guild, definitely had to involve getting your reputations maxed out. That's been true throughout WoW's history, at least since Wrath of the Lich King and probably before that too. It was still true at least for a while in Mists, but, well, I'm getting ahead of myself. Since Heroics and Wrath got your reputation up, that was another thing that made Heroics a clear step in the progression on your way in getting into raids. Another perk to maxing out your reputations was that you sometimes got recipes. For instance, the Mechgineer's Chopper is a good example of that, though ironically you had to not wear a tabard in order to get that, since running dungeons without a tabard boosted your reputation with the Northrend Alliance or Horde faction, and that was the faction that had your motorcycle blueprints. Anyhow, with all these additions to engineering, Wrath of the Lich King was an excellent time for engineering. There was room for improvement since vanilla had better goblin-gnomish dichotomy and our craftables could have had better demand. But since Wrath of the Lich King had that mode extractor, and since some of the coolest toys ever added were added in Wrath, I think it was engineering's heyday. It was certainly way better in Wrath than it was in Cataclysm, but I'll get ahead of myself if I start griping about the next expansion here. And I'm making these videos too long as it is, so I'll just say the next few videos will be about Cataclysm.